Let's review the different forms of selection. The first of these is stabilizing selection. This is simply where the extremes of the phenotype distribution are selected against, and the middle of the phenotype distribution, therefore, is selected for. All sorts of different examples of this. You could use body height or birth weight in human babies. We used birth weight in our example in class. Extremely low birth weight babies and extremely high birth weight babies have a lower probability of survival, and for that reason we end up with babies that weigh somewhere in the neighborhood of 7 pounds. So there is a selective advantage to being 7 pounds. If you're too heavy or too light, then your chances of survival are diminished. The next form of selection then is directional selection. An example of directional selection, as we mentioned in class, would be running speed in bunny rabbits. The slow bunny rabbits are captured and eaten by the coyotes. The fast bunny rabbits get away. So the result of that is that the coyotes are exerting selection pressure on the bunny rabbits. The slow ones, those alleles are not passed on to the next generation. The fast bunny rabbits are selected for. So overall, there is a directional shift in the average speed of bunny rabbits, so that they end up being faster and faster and faster. The next form of selection is disruptive selection, and here the center of the phenotype distribution is selected against, while the extremes are selected for. The example that we gave in class concerned the butterfly, a butterfly that has a broad geographic range. At either end of its geographic range, it coexists with another butterfly that is toxic. When it coexists with the toxic butterfly, it mimics the toxic butterfly. So when it's on the west coast, it has the same color pattern as the toxic butterfly, and all of the birds leave it alone. When it's on the east coast, it mimics another butterfly species, which is toxic, and it also is left alone by the birds. So it realizes a benefit by mimicking the toxic species. In the middle of its distributional range, however, it doesn't overlap either of the toxic species. And here it has a color pattern which conveys no benefit. And at this point, the birds consume it readily. So there is selection pressure against this average phenotype, the one that's in the middle, and the extremes are selected for. So that's an example of disruptive selection. There are a couple of additional forms of selection. One of these is sexual selection, and that is selection that's practiced by one sex on the opposite sex. So if you think about humans, males are selecting for certain attributes in females, and at the same time females are selecting for certain attributes in males. The example that we used in class was body size. Women have a tendency to date and mate with males that are somewhat taller than them. I suppose there are all sorts of reasons for that, but it is an attribute, and we talked about this in class, most women in class preferred dating men that were taller than they were. So that's sexual selection practiced by females on the males. In birds, females are selecting males on the basis of their song and on the basis of their color patterns. Males with bright colors have better diets, better nutrition, and so on, and they are the better catch for the female. The next form of natural selection is kin selection, and the example we used for this was the prairie dogs. Prairie dogs give alarm calls, and prairie dogs live in towns, and in the particular burrow that they occupy, they're surrounded by their kin. So when a prairie dog gives an alarm call, it is saving copies of its alleles in the form of its kin. So it sacrifices its own life, or it puts its own life in danger, but in doing so, it saves all these extra copies of its alleles in the form of its kin. If you transmit or you transplant the prairie dog to a different part of the town where it's not surrounded by kin, it still looks like it's giving the vigilance behavior. It stands on guard, but when the predator comes around, it does not emit the call. Instead, it just retreats into its burrow. So it no longer gives the alarm call when it's not surrounded by kin. So this is an example of kin selection. The animal is practicing behaviors that benefit its kin but does not benefit strangers. And you can think of all sorts of examples where this occurs in nature. The next example, the final example, is group selection, and the best example of this are the lemmings on the cliffs of Dover committing suicide for the good of the population. And that's, we talked about that book published by V.C. Wynne-Edwards, and of course the Wonderful World of Disney video that was used to promote that idea. It turns out not to be true. Lemmings do not commit suicide for the good of the population. The lemmings on the coast down below that V.C. Wynne-Edwards discovered, on the beaches of Dover, were probably blown over by a storm or something to that effect. But think of it in this way: if you're a lemming and everybody is rushing, or a large group of lemmings are rushing to the cliff to commit suicide, and you stop and watch the other lemmings go over the cliff, all of those alleles for that behavior have been now removed from the population. And now you return to the other lemmings and then commence to reproduce. Your alleles have persisted. So if we think of lemmings as having two different alleles for this particular behavior, a selfish allele and a altruistic allele, where the altruistic allele causes you to commit suicide, clearly the altruistic allele is going to be selected against, and the selfish allele is going to be preserved and persist in the population. So that then, in a nutshell, are the different forms of selection that are important to us during this semester.